will be given by Gregor Gorjanc. Gregor Gorjanc is also working together with John as is relatively young star among animal geneticists. Gregor is was born in Slovenia, so he's actually also our neighbor. Gregor, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. So the last 2 days we were talking quite a bit about the imputation and a little bit about the economics of imputation, but we only gave you just one part of the story. I'll now in this lecture try to summarize most of the results we've done with genotyping, genomic selection, and imputation kind of on economic level, so that you're going to get an overview. Just to start, let's repeat genomic selection recipe. As you all know by now, to start a genomic selection, you need a so-called reference or training population of individuals that called genotype and phenotype. We use that information in some sort of a statistical procedure to get a so-called prediction equation. Then we can get a set of individuals, a selection candidate or prediction population of individuals that are only genotyped. We input that data into our prediction equation. We get predictions for the individuals, prediction of the genetic merit. We rank the individuals and select the best individuals as parents of the next generations. Right? Okay, so that's genomic selection. Now, in order to maximize our response to this genomic selection, we need to look at the accuracy, selection intensity, how much diversity, genetic diversity we have in our population. How long does it take to actually reach selection decisions? But also we need to look at how costly a particular type of selection decision is going to be. Now to maximize this response to selection, we can tweak all of these parameters in one way. Right? So a recipe to maximize this response to selection would be to build a large and a diverse training set, because that's going to give us very accurate predictions of breeding values. We want to minimize distance between training and the prediction set, because then the accuracy is high. We want to test as many selection candidates as possible in order to increase the selection intensity. We need to recycle our animals as quickly as possible in order to reduce the generation interval. Quite often we can't do really much about the diversity. However, with genomic data, we can try and make individuals that are genetically quite diverse. And if we do that, then with that we're going to maximize the variance within that class, within that family. And ideally, we might get some outlying individuals both to the negative side, but hopefully also on the positive side, so that we might get an outstanding individual. Right? Okay. Now all of this is very easy to write on a slide. And the problem is that all of the facts that I've mentioned here, they're all going to rock your cost significantly, right? So in a sense, we need to kind of take all these rules, apply the costs of all the selection decisions that actually optimize not just response, but response per unit of investment. Profit, exactly. Yeah. And this is pretty much what I'm going to talk about. I'm essentially going to go through three things. I'm going to show you how we can actually improve the economics of, essentially genotyping for genomic selection, because genotyping is one of the most expensive parts of genomic selection. In addition to phenotyping, but I'm not going to touch phenotyping at all. And I'm going to either achieve it through a sleep array imputation, or I'm going to use a technique called genotyping by sequencing, and I'm going to try to lower the cost by doing so-called low coverage sequencing. And then I'm going to try to use the same data and actually impute it and see how much can I benefit from it. Right. Now before going into that, let's remind ourselves what sequencing and array genotyping actually is. So if we have an individual, and these are the two chromosomes of that individual. The gamete that the individual got from mom and the other one that got from dad. We see that that individual at this particular position is a heterozygous individual, has a reference allele and an alternative allele. Now if we're doing sequencing, essentially what we do is we take this DNA, we chop it into fragments, and let's say that we're interested in sequencing this fragment. If we're going to sequence this fragment 1 time, then we can either just take the blue piece or the violet piece. So if we're going to read the blue piece, the only information we have that individual has an allele 0. If we want to call a genotype out of this, One way would be to say, well, that individual is a homozygous 00 or a 0 genotype. Of course, there's going to be potentially some uncertainty. Right? That individual might as well, just looking at this data, might as well be a heterozygous, but we're not seeing the other thing. And it's going to be vice versa if you just read this piece. Right? Now, if we do two eggs, we can read the blue piece twice. We can read the blue in the red, red in the blue, or red in the red. And as we increase the sequencing coverage, we'll actually at some point realize that this individual is heterozygous. But of course, doing sequencing with higher coverage costs us a bit more. And quite often you'll see that when people talk about sequencing, they quite often talk about something like 20, 30 eggs to really get an exact, a correct genotype call. But more and more people are actually looking at, can we actually reduce the cost of sequencing, and how low can we go? So that's sequencing. If you're doing SNP arrays, I'm not going to go into the chemistry of SNP arrays, but the process is pretty much similar. On the array, on the chip, you have probes, where these kind of fragments are being attached to those probes, and you have lots of probes for one particular locus, like this particular locus. Those probes are multiplied in 10 to 40 times, something like that, right? So in a way, you can think about array genotyping being really high coverage sequencing of particular parts in the genome. And then obviously the array data is going to be very accurate data, while the low coverage sequencing data might be quite inaccurate in a way that the reads might actually be quite accurate, but the genotype calls from that might be inaccurate or uncertain. So with both SNP arrays and the sequencing technologies in mind, we can draw this plot where I'm trying to bring all the different genomic platforms on one scale, where we are looking at how many loci are we targeting from just a few, 10, 100, or actually the whole genome. That's one dimension. The other dimension is how accurate is the data from rather uncertain to really certain data. And as I said, SNP arrays tend to give us very accurate genotype data, and they kind of target between a couple of hundred and then let's say up to 1 million or so positions in the genome. If you do a whole genome sequencing with really high coverage, you're going to get the whole genome with very accurate genotype calls, but the problem is it's going to be very costly. And ideally, when you think about cost, you kind of want to be in this domain with the cost, right? But then you obviously get quite inaccurate data, and only for a few positions, and that data is not really useful. So in the middle ground, you have a set of technologies that have very different names. For example, you might their particular protocol might be called genotype by sequencing. Another very similar one might be called rat sequencing, and there are others. The idea with these protocols is we're not sequencing the full genome. We're sequencing just parts of the genome. And then depending on how deep the sequencing is, what the coverage is, the data can be either quite uncertain to very certain. Okay, now let's see what a SNP array imputation can do for us. So I'm going to be trying to use low number of markers on a SNP array. I'm going to try to do imputation to kind of push them up. And I'm going to be looking at manipulating that in a set of our prediction or selection candidates. And my goal is to try to reduce the cost of selection decisions in this prediction candidate. Okay, and this actually has been done quite a number of years ago, and this is pig setting in a pig breeding program. These are the numbers that that particular breeding program had. They're generating something like 500 sires per year and more than 10,000 dams per year. Each year they are trying to genotype of the order of 100,000 individuals. At that time, there were a set of different SNP arrays that were available to them with different density and different costs. Today, the costs are much lower, but the principles still apply. And then the idea, what has been done in this particular study was what kind of array should we use for sires, dam, and candidates such that we can generate accurate data that's going to allow us to give us accurate genomic predictions, but hopefully for minimum amount of money. And here you have a set of strategies, a pre-selected set of strategies. So here I'm showing what kind of SNP array data has been used on the maternal granddams and the paternal granddams, what kind of SNP array has been used on the sires. this is a set of scenarios where SARS was always genotyped with the so-called high density array with 60,000 markers. Then we have a DAMS not big genotype, having 400 markers, 3,000, 6,000, 60K, and then similarly for the candidates. Here is the cost per candidate. In this line, I'm showing you the accuracy of imputation. So this being the high density data, so there is no imputation. This is the reference case. As you see, when I have on the candidate less and less markers, and equally so on the DAMs, the accuracy of imputation is going down, but still the accuracy actually is quite high. Then in the second to last column, I'm showing the accuracy between the reading value we would obtain with a high density genotype and an imputed one, so-called information retained. Right? What you tend to see is that this information retained tends to be somewhat lower than the imputation accuracy, however, still quite high. Now if I translate, so this is the accuracy that matters for the breeder's equation, right? Yes, no, so that's the accuracy. So if you look at the breeder's equation and the accuracy value in that particular equation, let's say it's 0.4, then we need to multiply that 0.4 with this value. Okay? And if you do that, and we actually also take into account the costs, what we can see is that if we take this scenario where everybody is genotyped with high density, if we take this as a reference, we see how much can we gain in response per unit of cost with different scenarios. And what you see is the scenario where SAR is genotyped with 60K, then with 400 markers, candidate with 400 markers. So the cost for this particular scenario is more than $20 per candidate. We're going to get 5 times more response to selection for equal cost. Right? And this actually, remember this number because it's going to be repeating quite often. So for the same amount of investment, you get 5 times more response. Okay, that's the sleep array imputation. So let's say what we can do with the genotyping by sequencing technology and just trying to reduce the coverage. So just to remind you, I'm in this domain and I'm going to use a particular set of markers, and instead of using sort of kind of quite high coverage, I'm going to try to lower the coverage and see what that does, what kind of things this allows me to do in my data. Okay. I'm going to show you just a couple of details, just a couple of main messages, but details you can see them in this particular paper. Just to briefly summarize what we've done a simulation where we each generation made 25 male, 500 female, and then we genotype their progeny either with 3,000, 10,000, 50,000, or 300,000 markers, and we genotype those markers either with a sleep array or with a genotyping by sequencing technology. We assume we can either assemble a training population of 500, 10,000, etc., up to 50,000 individuals. Then we were trying to predict the dimension. Okay? So what I'm showing here is the correlation between the true and the predicted breeding value, depending on what kind of data I'm doing. So just to summarize, if I'm at this stage, I'm using SNP data both in training and prediction. If I'm, let's say, at this particular point, I'm using genotyping by sequencing data, both in training and prediction. And the logic going from SNP array to GBS is that GBS with lower coverage, and this is going to be cheaper. Okay? And I'm mostly interested about, how does that influence accuracy. So let's focus first on this particular point. If I use SNP data both in training and prediction, what we see is that I'm getting accuracy of almost 0.6 with 300,000 markers. I'm pretty much getting the same accuracy. The green line is behind it with 60,000 markers, so you don't really need hundreds of thousands of markers for genomic selection. 50,000 markers is more than enough. Actually, even with 10,000 markers, you see I'm pretty much on the same level. So within a particular population, if we can get 10,000 segregating markers in that population, that's more than enough for genomic selection. Okay? Now, if I actually start to then decrease the number of markers, let's say to 3,000, then you start to see significant growth. Okay? So this is SNP data where we assume where the data is accurate. This is the true genotype of those particular rows. Okay? Now, as I start to use genotyping by sequencing, if the coverage is 20, that means that each position in the genome is on average genotyped 20 times. I'm going to see what kind of values that particular individual carries. Right? So I'm going to be able to call all 3 genotypes with a very high accuracy. And we see that then that the accuracy doesn't drop. But when I start to decrease the coverage much more so, let's say if I go down to 1x, now I start to see quite a bit of variation. However, if I have, let's say 50,000 or a couple of hundreds of thousands of markers, that drop in accuracy is practically insignificant. And just to remind yourself, if I'm doing 1x, that means that on average, I'm sequencing those markers once, on average. That means that on average, I'm not able to call a genotype. Right? I just see one allele or another. Okay? And in particular, for particular positions, I actually don't have any reads. So on average, I kind of have almost half of the data is empty. My genotype table is empty. And I just fill it with the population allele frequency. Okay? And look, I can still get very decent accuracies. Depending on what the cost is, it's quite debatable, depending on with what kind of provider we work with. But at the time when we were doing this, I'm not going to tell you the numbers, I'm going to tell you some numbers later on. But 1x genotyping, 1x GBS was quite substantially cheaper than SNP array data. However, today the SNP array, the cost of the SNP array data is coming down as well, quite significantly. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, in this slide, is I'm going to try to use different kind of coverage in training and prediction and see is there any middle in space. So this is again, and I'm only showing it for the highest density when I had 300,000 markers. The red dots are the previous line that I've shown you on the previous graph. Right? This, on the X, I have sequencing coverage in training. And the different lines is the sequencing coverage in prediction. Okay, let's focus on 1x. If I do 1x in training and very high coverage in prediction, I'm essentially going to get the maximum prediction accuracy I can get. If I do 1x in training and I also do 1x in prediction, I get substantial loss in prediction accuracy. So it seems that coverage on the prediction individuals really matters. Okay, now let's flip the problem around. Let's do very low coverage in training, right? So just to remind you again, 0.01 coverage. That means that only 1% of the rows are going to be read once. So most of the data is going to be empty. Right? So if I do that kind of really low coverage sequencing in training, but I do, let's say, 10x or 20x in prediction, I do get some loss, but the loss is not that dramatic, right? So once again, what this tells us is the training data can be quite sparsely sequenced with a real low coverage, as long as it's quite sizable, right? We just need to get rough genotype information on the training data. However, collectively, that data does carry information when we're estimating the least substitution effects. But when I go and I apply that prediction equation to one particular individual, I need to be sure what the genotype of that particular individual is, because it's only one individual. Right? So in prediction, the coverage really matters. In training, it matters less. It does matter, but it matters much less. And this is actually really important, for example, if you're struggling to start with genomic selection in a particular population, because usually the first bottleneck is actually getting a sizable training set. Right? And this is a way how to build a sizable training set for less money. Okay? So now what I'm doing here is I'm expanding the training set, and this slide is actually quite full. So on the x-axis I'm showing the size of the training set, but I'm assuming that I have fixed amount of money. So what I can do is I can take 500 individuals and I can sequence everybody in 2x. Which means that I'm going to collectively spend 1,000x sequencing on these 500 individuals, right? And I can, if I have these kind of resources, then if I have a training set with 1,000 individuals, I can only do 1x, and if I have 50,000, I can only do 0.02x, right? If I have more resources, I can do a bit more coverage. Okay. So while I'm doing this, I'm trying to expand the training population, that when I'm going to use this data to predict selection candidates, the accuracy hopefully is going to be higher. And what you see is that if I do more individuals in training, you see that the accuracy prediction is obviously increasing. I'm showing two sets of lines. The full line is when I have GBS data in training and SNP, the really accurate data in prediction. These are the full lines. And the dashed lines are when I'm using GBS both in training and prediction. And again, if I do GBS, very low coverage GBS both training and prediction, it starts to see the loss. But if I had SNP data in prediction, the accuracy is, look, it went pretty much from 0.4 to almost 0.8, right? And on the previous slide, this was, if you remember, was almost 0.6. This was the reference. So GBS with lower coverage allows me to expand the training set and get a higher accuracy of genomic prediction.
Can I ask a question on this one? Because the GBS has different SNPs to the
Yes.
array. So
Yes.
how do you merge this?
Here we did assume there are actually the same SNPs, and that might be a problem. Right?
But that's serious.
Yeah, definitely. However, we can think about SNP data as being GBS with really high coverage. So if you would consider using genotyping-based sequencing, you could say, okay, I'm going to use shallow sequencing on the training individuals, but I'm going to use deep sequencing on the prediction individuals, but use genotyping-based sequencing with both. Yeah. But you're right that SNP arrays and the GBS, they tend to target different markers, and that when you merge them, that's going to change. Definitely. Okay, now we flip the problem around and said, can we use the same technique to actually expand its selection candidates? Now I'm targeting the selection intensity. Can I increase the selection intensity? Applying the same logic, and you see that looking at then how responsive selection is going to change, you again see that we can, from these reference scenarios, we can pretty much almost double response to selection, right? And this is for the same amount of cost. Okay, so just to summarize this set of results, so it seems that if we're using low coverage genotyping sequencing, we can lower the cost of building a training population. I think this is really an important message because quite often this is the kind of the stumbling block to start the genomic selection. We can also expand training population to get larger accuracies, and we can test more selection candidates. And from all the results that I've shown you, it seems that the optimum was always to genotype more individuals with a bit noisier genotype data. It's always good to have very accurate data, but if you're only going to get, because you want accurate data for a very limited amount of individuals, that perhaps you shouldn't be doing. If you want to be doing breeding, you kind of have to think about whole population or at least sizable number of animals. And genotyping-based sequencing is one way to go. Now I have to say that genotype sequencing data is much harder to work with than SNP array genotype data. And we've seen quite a lot of breeding programs when GBS came out. There was a big hype, and some breeding programs didn't know anything about genomic selection. They saw genotyping-based sequencing as a way it's going to solve all their problems. They started using GBS, also in the beginning phases when genotyping-based sequencing data technology was not well developed, and they still don't have genomic selection even today after I think 10 years. Right? So genotyping sequencing data is a bit trickier to work with. But I can tell you, for example, in New Zealand, they are actually using it in production setting. They're really having really good results. So that, for example, New Zealand is an example where genotyping-based sequencing data is being used to a great effect. Okay? Now, we've been using genotyping-based sequencing data. I was just manipulating the coverage. Now, can I manipulate the coverage and use imputation technique to actually try to get even more maneuvering space? Right? And I'm going to be doing it in two ways. I'm going to either have low coverage data on a small number of markers and impute both in terms of quality and the density, but actually just have lots of markers and just improve the quality. This is a planned reading setting. Again, I'm going to show you just the main messages. The details are available in this paper. Just to summarize a little what we've done, we've done again one simulation. We have a set of 40 parents. These are inbred lines. We do a set of crosses, and we've done 80 crosses, where we, in the F3 generation, have individuals both genotype and phenotype. This is going to constitute our training set. Then I have another set of 80 crosses that have some parents in common. And this data only has genotype data, and we're going to be doing genomic selection on these sets of genotypes. I'm having a trait with a phenotype of 10%. We either have 10,000 or 100,000 markers, assuming that these markers are being targeted with a SNP array or a really, really high density GBS, or GBS between 4x to 0.01x. Okay? And again, as before, I'm going to be manipulating the training and prediction set as well as the coverage of genotyping by sequencing. And I'm going to be showing the results. How does this affect accuracy, response to selection, but now very importantly also return on investment. Okay? Now first let's have a look at how accurate is genotyping by sequencing data with respect to the true underlying genotype. Okay? So first let's look at the raw GBS data. So GBS data with 4x coverage, which means that on average at every marker we're getting 4 reads. Okay? So with 4 reads you can think about that if an individual is heterozygous, you might get, you might get 4 zeros sometimes, but quite likely one of those 4 reads is going to read, the other allele. And what you see is that on average, the accuracy of that data not being imputed or whatever, just taking 4 reads and correlating that with the true genotype, the accuracy is about 0.9. So 4x GBS data, you don't really need to do imputation. You can do imputation, but you only have this maneuvering space, so it's actually quite meaningful. 4x GBS data is very accurate. You can actually use it as it is already. And I think in New Zealand, they are generating GBS data around with this coverage. I don't know exactly, but I think that's what they're doing. And as you see, it's actually quite accurate data already. You can just go with it.
Working on this one at 4x, we worked on the QLab probabilities, or you set one QLab based on.
So what we did is, for example, if we got 4 reads and 3 reads were 0 and a 1. And the 4th one was a 1, we just sum them up and divide by 4. So just sum them up, we divide by 4, so it's kind of an average allele dosage. Yeah. And if the allele is if we don't have any reads, we just insert the population of yeah. And in a way, because the average allele dosage is kind of expectation over the genotype probabilities, I'm taking the genotype uncertainty probabilities in our estimation. Yeah. But it is true, I'm just working with the mean, not the whole distribution. That's true. Okay, now if I do imputation, and we did it with the alpha impute, with the HMM option, within every family, what you see is that we pretty much lift this up to at least 0.8 or even more so, depending on the number of markers. So the pink line is with the 10,000 markers, 100,000, the blue line is with the 100,000 markers. I'll please focus on these two points, 0.1 and 0.01. You see that they pretty much have the same amount, the same kind of accuracy of the data after imputation, and they are actually they are 10 times different coverage, but also the number of markers is roughly 10 times different. So you kind of see that the relationships are approximately linear. Okay. So now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using this type of data and trying to see how accurate are going to be my genomic prediction. So just to summarize, in training set, I have 25 families. I have 80 families. Within each family, I take 25 individuals. So my training set is 2,000 individuals that have genotype and phenotype, and I'm going to be predicting other 80 families that have not been phenotyped at all. They have been just genotype. And in each family I take 400 individuals, so I'm going to be predicting 32,000 individuals. Okay, it's a bit hard to see, but what you see here is I'm showing prediction accuracy within each family or across families. I think that for breeding program, what really matters is we need to be targeting accuracy within each family because that shows us how accurate are we in predicting the median example terms. Okay, so it's the same as before. This is SNP array data, both in training and prediction. So we are getting accuracy for the order of 0.5. And when I start using GBS data, we go coverage, and before we see we're getting reduction. This is 100,000 markers and 10,000 markers, is exactly as before in that livestock setting. But when I use imputation, I pretty much recover all of the loss in this prediction accuracy, even, with, let's say, if I use 100,000 markers and very low coverage, right, 1%, I have pretty much the same accuracy as with this. Yeah. Now let's see what does this mean in terms of return on investment. So we had to speculate a little bit what the costs are, and your cost model might be slightly different. So we assume that the cost for 10,000 snip array is going to be $30. For the 100,000 marker snip array is going to be $70. With the GBS, it was a bit trickier, but our model, you can read the details in the paper. We got numbers from different providers, but the range for 10,000 markers range between $9 and $5. And with the 100,000 markers, it ranges between $45 and $5. What you'll see is that the lower number, this is when we have really low coverage, they're pretty much the same cost. And actually, in this particular simulation, we assume that the library preparation, so DNA isolation and library preparation is going to cost us $5. Now, actually, just library preparation without DNA, because DNA extraction is going to be both for both of them, so we ignore that. So when you go to really, really low coverage, the sequencing is actually doesn't cost you almost anything, right? What really costs you then is library preparation. Okay, so again, as before, I'm having snip array or GBS with different kind of coverage, and this is return on investment. If I use 10,000 markers, this was my reference return on investment on a snip array data. If I use 100,000 markers on the snip array data, I have low return on investment. And this again clearly shows you that in a breeding program, you only need about 10,000 segregating markers to do effective genomic selection. If you're going to have hundreds of thousands of markers, you're actually throwing money away on those markers, right? You don't need so many. You kind of just need about 10,000 or so segregating in the population. As I start to use GBS with lower coverage, you see that then the return on investment kind of stabilizes on 5, as before with the low density snip array mutation. Right? Now, of course, when I start to decrease coverage, the return on investment at some point starts to fall off. This is without imputation, but when I do imputation, I recover pretty much. Okay. Now, can we use the same technique to manipulate the size of the training set? So now I'm training either on 2,000 or all the way up to 32,000 individuals. And what you will see is that when I increase the size of the training set, but at the same time keep the cost fixed, so I need to reduce the coverage. Well, I see that the return investment does increase, but at most it's going to increase something like, for 50%. Right? If I look in the prediction, now if you remember before results from the livestock population, I said in training we can have quite shallow sequencing, but when we do one particular individual, we need to have high coverage sequencing. Okay? Now what I'm trying to do in this particular setting is take that approach, but I want to do low coverage sequencing with that individual if I'm going to have lots of selection candidates. But I've said before to you that this is not going to work. The accuracy is really going to drop. However, if I can impute that individual high up, then actually I can make it really cost effective. And what you'll see is, what you'll see is, the message here is the full line is when I have snip array data, and the upper line is GBS without imputation and GBS with imputation. So actually, I can actually generate something like 6 to 8 times more response to selection. High return on investment if I use GBS. Okay, and then we looked at manipulating both the reference and the prediction set. It's a bit hard to see, but the darker line means higher return on investment for this particular breeding program. This line is 10,000 markers, 100,000 markers. So the first thing you see that the colors tend to be darker here. So 10,000 again is better than 100,000. Then I have snip array, I have GBS imputed and GBS not imputed. So again, GBS data is darker than snip array data, so GBS tends to be cheaper. And GBS imputed seems to be the cheapest, and the optimum seems to be to do, it's a bit hard to see, to do 4,000 individuals in training and 50 individuals within each family of those 8. So quite often we say you need to have the largest training set possible, and you need to genotype as many individuals as possible, right? But what you see actually from these results is, to kind of get going and to optimize depending on the cost. With 4,000 individuals, training set we can actually get quite optimal results. And we don't need to genotype just about everybody. After we genotype quite a sizable proportion of our selection candidates, we're going to capture pretty much a large proportion of genetic variants in that population. So we don't need to genotype every single individual. When you're thinking in economic terms. If you want to really find the best genotype, then you'll have to genotype everybody. But then that's going to be very expensive. Okay? So again, just to summarize, if we look at the potential of imputed GBS, again, it allows us to lower the cost of building a training population. It expands us to training population for even larger accuracies. And now we can test really large number of selection candidates because we can genotype, we can sequence them at very low coverage and impute them up to high coverage. And again, the optimum was, as you've seen, do more individuals with a bit noisier data. That was the message even before. Without imputation, now if I do imputation, I can go even lower and impute higher. And essentially now where we're going in our project is we're kind of now with sleeper data, we're at this point, and with low coverage GBS, we're at this point, and we would like, the next step is pushing all this data up to so that everybody's going to have high quality, full genome sequencing. Thank you.
Any questions?
Sure, yeah, please.
It's been a warm day now. Well, thank you, Gregor. And
There's a question.
yes.
So you say the average coverage is, let's say, 1,
Yeah.
but it's a large chunk of genome. Do you have some areas where there's less than 1,
Yeah.
more than 1? What's your experience with that? How much variability do you have to do?
So
Currently available technology.
yesterday, John showed a slide, and I'm going to try to find it. It definitely varies, but I wouldn't be worried too much. Now, if you're trying to find a particular, if you're very focused on a particular region of the genome for, let's say, trying to find a gene or something like that, then coverage does become important. If you're trying to do genomic selection, then coverage at a particular site is not really that important. But definitely it does vary. Some parts of the genome are easier to sequence and some parts are harder to sequence. So there are kind of two processes happening at the same time. What you're referring is to the following, what we call sequenceability. Some parts of the genome are hard to sequence, and in those regions you're going to see, if one is a sort of an average sequenceability, there are going to be parts of the genome that are really hard to sequence. You might actually never see a read to the 0, right? But then some parts are actually really easy to sequence, you're going to see more reads. So this is one part, this is property of a genome. But then the property of the sequencer, because the DNA segments are coming to the sequencer in different way at random, and then depending how much sequencing resources we throw at a particular sample, we are going to have these variations. So I believe this is targeted 30x sequencing, this is 30x, but we're going to get quite a bit of variation, let's say between 10 and 60x. Now when we combine the property of the sequencer and the property of the genome for 30x sequencing, we're going to get this kind of distribution. So some sites are going to have still 0 reads. Those are sites that are virtually impossible to sequence with the usual sequencer. On average, we're kind of going to get 30x, but then some sites are actually going to have even more than 100x. Now this is with 30x. This is going to be distribution with 10x, right? So we have this tail. This is 1x, right? So quite a lot of sites without any reads, but some with 1, but some with 2, 3, 4. Then as the coverage is increasing, the distribution. Yeah. But definitely, if you're focusing on a particular part of the genome, but you want to do something with that thing, then GBS might not be, at least low coverage sequencing might not be your best thing. If you can actually do the families, as we are doing in the whole genome sequencing approach, then even with low coverage you can do that, but then you need to use imputation too. recover the loss in information, right? In low coverage instead of high coverage.
So Gregor, if you would just cover exons very thoroughly, deeply,
Yeah.
will you lose a lot on prediction equation?
So we don't have any experience with doing exome sequencing. It has been proposed as a very effective strategy in human genetics a while ago, where they were saying the logic is if I do exomes, that's where I have the coding variation.
Like here, you GBS, you restrict yourself
Yeah.
on just an exon areas, under assumption that they bring majority of variation.
Yes, I think that the conclusion is that the prediction accuracies are about the same, because effectively exons are more or less pretty much randomly distributed along the genome. Not exactly, but more or less. If you sequence the exomes, you kind of have enough effective markers across the genome that you kind of cover variation across the genome. So genomic selection with that data is going to work well. And it's not going to beat much. So the disappointing result was that we're just targeting on the exons. You don't really discover that many more variants, or your prediction accuracies do not increase that much. And one of the reasons for that is that it seems that quite a lot of variation is being generated not due to variation at the exons, but actually the regulatory systems. I think that's kind of the prevailing summary. Would you agree with me on this one? But I haven't done any of the exome sequencing, etc. So take it with a pinch of salt.
No, I was thinking in your data set, just you hide all variation except exon one, and then you see how good you are.
But then again, because
Empirically, and then just you can.
I see why they propose that, because that's the logic, right? That's where variation is supposed to come from. But then on the other hand, variation at those positions are pretty much suppressed from evolutionary processes. So there is variation in exons, but it's not massive. While in the regulatory elements, there is more variation or around them. And it seems that that's driving more variation in our complex phenotypes. And I'm not biologist by any means, but actually I think it about a body is a car, an engine, right? And in a car you have several things that need to work for a car to drive, right? And these are the exons. And if you fill with those exons, car is pretty much going to stop, right? But there are parts in the car, like color of the car, it doesn't matter, it's still going to drive, right? So there are things in the genome that you can tweak quite easily.
But then tires doesn't matter.
They do matter, but they don't matter. They're not crucial. I mean, even if you don't have tires, you can still drive because you're not going to drive very far and fast.
Maybe I didn't get, but what's the imputation cost? Is there a cost?
It's pretty much zero, I would say. I mean, it does cost, but the algorithms are getting better and better every day. So,
Who is doing that? I mean,
a reading program should have labor cost. Yeah, it is a significant. It is a thing that someone needs to get the data. I would actually say that for some reading programs that perhaps don't have the expertise and personnel to do this kind of thing, it actually might be a big cost. And if you don't plan for it, the reading program might really. So we have examples. We've collaborated with reading programs where they went with the GBS and it's a total disaster. And even after 10 years, they still don't have genomic selection because they underestimate exactly the question that you're asking, right? So GBS again is a bit more complicated. It's not very complicated, but it's a bit more complicated. If you don't have the personnel to be able to do data science and run imputation, then that's going to be an important issue. Actually, if you don't solve that, you're not going to get genomic selection. But I think it's not getting much more significant. It is quite a significant computational cost with whole genomes. But if you do GBS, which is just essentially a sleep array, then 10,000 to 100,000 markers is not such a big. But I have to say, even with whole genome sequencing, the techniques are getting better and better. We have a review just going to come out now, I believe, in genetic selection and evolution, where we looked at the human genetics HLM type of algorithms applied to it's actually sleep array data. The same logic applies to sequencing like data, and the speeds are tremendous these days. And these are really expensive HMMs. The pedigree methods are actually even more expensive. So, yeah. Colleagues, I can tell you, colleagues have been doing the whole genome sequencing imputation for one chromosome in pigs for a population of about 80,000 animals. They were able to do whole sequence imputation of sequence data within a day for one chromosome. So, yeah. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. So now we are at the end of our course, and we can clap our colleagues once more for all the beautiful stuff they bring into our knowledge.